It was a quiet evening. Emma Reynolds, a 25-year-old freelance graphic designer, sat comfortably in her dimly lit apartment, wrapped in her favorite blue pajamas. The only sounds were the ticking of the clock and the occasional hum of passing cars outside. She reached for her steaming cup of chamomile tea, ready to settle into a peaceful night of reading. But then her phone rang. She frowned. It was past midnight. Who would be calling her now? A hesitant finger hovered over the screen before she finally answered. "Hello?" she said, her voice slightly wary. Silence. Then a deep, calm voice spoke. "You look nice in those blue pajamas, Emma." Her breath caught in her throat. She instinctively glanced around her small apartment. The windows were closed. The curtains were drawn. But still, someone was watching her. "Who is this?" she demanded, gripping the phone tighter. The caller chuckled softly. Too soft. Too calm. "You shouldn't leave your tea unattended," he murmured. "It's getting cold." Emma's stomach twisted in fear. She looked down at the cup in her hands. It had been steaming just moments ago. How did he know? The search for the watcher. Heart-pounding, Emma leaped from the couch and rushed to the nearest window. She yanked the curtains open and stared into the dark, empty street below. No one. Her mind raced. Is this a prank? A sick joke? She turned off all the lights, letting only the dim glow of her phone screen illuminate the room. Slowly, she inched toward the door, pressing her eye against the peephole. The hallway was eerily silent. Still. But then, a shadow moved. A figure, just beyond her field of vision. Was he inside the building? A cold sweat broke across her skin. Taking a deep breath, Emma whispered into the phone. "Who are you?" The voice on the other end let out a sigh, almost disappointed. "You don't remember me, do you?" Her mind reeled. Remember? Who was he? "Don't worry," the caller continued. "You will." Then the line went dead, and at that exact moment, Emma's apartment lights flickered once, twice. Then, total darkness. Fear takes hold. Emma's breath hitched. She was alone, or at least she thought she was. Her hands trembled as she pressed her phone against her chest. Call someone. Call for help. She quickly dialed her best friend, James. It rang twice before he picked up. "Emma, it's late. What's wrong?" Someone called me," she whispered, creeping toward her kitchen where she kept a knife. "They knew what I was wearing, what I was doing, and now my power is out." James' voice immediately sharpened. "Lock your doors. Stay on the line. I'm coming over." Emma reached the kitchen counter, her fingers brushing against the cold handle of a knife. And then her phone buzzed. New message from unknown number. "You shouldn't have called him." Emma's blood ran cold. A new message followed. "Now you have 10 minutes. A race against time." Emma's hands shook as she reread the message. 10 minutes until what?" she whispered. James's voice cut through the silence. "Emma, are you still there?" "James," she choked out. "He just texted me. He knows I called you." A brief pause, then James cursed under his breath. "I'm calling the cops. Don't hang up." Emma clutched the knife tightly, backing into a corner of the room. Outside, the wind howled, rattling her apartment window. She swore she heard footsteps in the hallway. Then, another message. 9 minutes. Her stomach twisted into knots. What did he mean? What was going to happen in 9 minutes? She tried to steady her breathing. Think, Emma, think. Had she locked the door? No. Heart hammering, she sprinted toward the entrance. Just as she reached for the deadbolt, 8 minutes. A sharp, loud knock echoed through her apartment. Emma froze. She pressed her ear to the door. No sound, no movement. But she wasn't going to take any chances. She locked every single bolt. The window revelation. She needed to get out. Now. Her eyes darted to the fire escape outside her bedroom window. If she could just get there, she could. 7 minutes. She felt watched. Turning her head slowly, Emma's eyes landed on the mirror across the room. And that's when she saw it, a faint shadow, standing behind her. A choked scream escaped her lips as she spun around. Nothing. No one was there. But on the mirror there was now a message, written in condensation. Too late. The call that changed everything. Emma stumbled backward, her breath coming in panicked gasps. She grabbed her phone with trembling fingers and redialed James. Emma, the cops are on their way. James, he's inside. He's been inside this whole time. Another knock, this time Harder. Emma let out a shaky sob. 5 minutes. The sound of sirens wailed faintly in the distance. They're almost there, James reassured her. Emma tried to keep herself together, pressing a hand over her mouth to silence her ragged breathing. Then something slid under her door. A small white envelope with her name written on it. Hands shaking, she picked it up and slowly tore it open. Inside was a single Polaroid picture. Emma's stomach dropped. It was a picture of her sleeping in her bed. 4 minutes. She dropped the envelope, her legs giving out beneath her. Tears welled in her eyes. Who was he? How long had he been watching? The knocking came again. But this time it wasn't just at the door. It was at her bedroom window too. 3 minutes. Emma let out a terrified scream as her bedroom window slammed open. The power flickered back on, and standing outside, bathed in the dim light, was a man in a black hoodie holding a knife. 2 minutes. Emma backed away, but he didn't move. He just stood there, grinning. And then, 1 minute. The final second. Police sirens screeched outside. The knocking at her door stopped. The hooded man tilted his head, his grin fading. Then he turned and ran, disappearing into the night. The front door burst open, officers flooding into the room, guns drawn. Emma collapsed, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face. She had survived, but the voice on the phone? The one who knew everything? See you soon, Emma? Click. The line went dead. Emma sat in her dimly lit apartment, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Even with the police officers around her, she still felt watched. Detective Mark Sullivan knelt beside her, his voice calm but firm. Emma, I need you to tell me everything about the calls, every word. She tried to steady her breathing, but the image of that hooded figure outside her window kept flashing in her mind. He knew everything, she whispered. What I was wearing, what I was drinking. He knew when I called James. He even knew when the cops were coming. Detective Sullivan exchanged a look with his partner. Something about Emma's case had struck a nerve. Emma, he said slowly, have you heard of the Midnight Watcher murders? Her breath hitched. What? The chilling connection. Sullivan leaned forward. 5 years ago, 2 women in this city started getting strange calls. The voice on the other end described their lives in disturbing detail. Their clothes, their habits, their secrets. Emma gripped the blanket tighter. And then what? The detective hesitated. Both of them were found dead exactly 1 week after their first call. A shiver crawled up Emma's spine. How did they die? Their throats were slit, no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, just a phone beside them with the last call from an unknown number. Emma's heart pounded. It was the same pattern. Sullivan taught him. The calls stopped after the last victim. Until now. Emma felt a lump in her throat. Why now? Why her? Then Sullivan asked the question that made her blood run cold. Emma, did you know either of those women? Her mind raced. But no. The names, the cases, they weren't familiar. No, I've never met them. The detective nodded, though his face remained tense. Then why did he choose you? A disturbing revelation. Later that night, Emma stayed at James's apartment. She couldn't go back home. Not yet. James did his best to comfort her. It's over, Em. They'll catch him. You're safe here. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around midnight, her phone buzzed. New email, unknown sender. Subject, I told you I'd see you soon. Hands trembling, she opened it. A single image. It was a photo of her sleeping in James's apartment. Emma gasped, nearly dropping the phone. James, she cried, shoving the screen toward him. He paled. How the hell? Before he could finish, Emma's phone rang. James immediately grabbed his own phone. I'll trace it. Keep him talking. Emma hesitated, then answered. What do you want from me? The deep, familiar voice chuckled. Emma, you still don't understand, do you? Her blood ran cold. It was never about what I want, it's about what you forgot. She gritted her teeth. I don't even know who you are. Another dark chuckle. Oh, but you do. And soon, you'll remember everything. Click. The call ended. James cursed under his breath. Damn it, the number's untraceable. Emma clutched her phone. What was she supposed to remember? And more importantly, was she next? The hidden clue. James, being the tech genius he was, hacked into the metadata of the email. It's bouncing off multiple locations, but he squinted at the screen. Wait, there's something here. Emma leaned over. What? He pointed at a small detail in the email's encryption. This was sent from a local server, which means Emma finished his sentence in horror. He's in this city, James exhaled. Not just in the city, he's close. Emma clenched her fists. Then we find him before he finds me. James hesitated. Emma, this guy isn't just a stalker. He's a killer. She met his gaze. Then let's make sure I don't become his next victim. The trap. With the police still investigating, Emma and James devised a plan. If the stalker had been in her apartment, he might have left something behind. They returned to her place in broad daylight, accompanied by Officer Sullivan. The moment they stepped inside, Emma felt it. Something was different. Everything looked the same, yet something had been moved. Sullivan pulled out his flashlight and scanned the room. Check for anything out of place. Emma carefully walked toward her nightstand, and that's when she saw it, a small piece of folded paper. She slowly picked it up, her hands shaking. Opening it, she read the chilling message inside. Tomorrow, 11:58 p.m. Don't be late. Her heart pounded. Tomorrow? What happens tomorrow? She whispered. James and Sullivan exchanged a grim look. He's setting a date. Emma's fingers tightened around the paper. Then, let's give him exactly what he wants. The bait. They set the trap. At exactly 11:58 p.m., Emma sat alone in her apartment. Or at least, that's what it looked like. The police were hidden in the shadows, watching, waiting. James monitored everything from a surveillance van outside. Then, at exactly 11:58, her phone rang. Emma took a deep breath and answered. You're right on time, the voice murmured. She clenched her fists. What do you want? The same thing I've always wanted, Emma, for you to remember. Suddenly, James's voice crackled through her earpiece. Emma, the call, it's coming from inside the building. It's coming from inside the building. Her blood turned to ice. She slowly turned her head and saw her bedroom door creak open. A figure stepped out, tall, dark, face covered, and in his hand, a knife. James's voice was frantic. Emma, get out now! The figure took a step forward, and as Emma's breath hitched, the last thing she heard before everything went black was the voice whispering in her ear. You should have remembered sooner. Emma's eyes fluttered open. A sharp pain throbbed in her head. Her vision was blurry, and for a moment she had no idea where she was. Then she remembered. The call. The figure in her apartment. The whisper. You should have remembered sooner. She tried to move, but realized her wrists were tied. Panic surged through her as she struggled against the bindings. She wasn't in her apartment anymore. The walls were bare concrete. A single flickering light bulb buzzed overhead. Her breathing became ragged. Where was she? And who brought her here? The voice returns. A metallic clank echoed through the room. A door opened, and heavy footsteps approached. Emma's heartbeat pounded in her ears as a tall figure stepped into the dim light. He was wearing a mask. Plain, featureless, cold. But the voice behind it, she recognized it. You look scared, Emma. Her stomach twisted. What do you want from me? She snapped, trying to keep her fear from showing. The man chuckled. You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about what I want, it's about what you need to remember. Emma's mind raced. Remember what? The masked figure knelt in front of her, tilting his head. Tell me, Emma, do you remember the name Lillian Carter? Emma's breath caught in her throat. Lillian Carter. The name sent a chill down her spine. Yes! She remembered, but she had spent years trying to forget. The forgotten truth. Lillian Carter had been Emma's childhood best friend. They had grown up together, inseparable. But one night, when they were both 16 years old, Lillian disappeared. The entire town searched for her, but she was never found. No body, no clues, just gone. Emma had blamed herself, because on the night Lillian vanished, Emma had been the last person to see her alive. The memory came rushing back like a crashing wave, a dark road, a stranger's car, Lillian's voice whispering, "Run, Emma, run." And then, nothing. Emma swallowed hard. How do you know about Lillian? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The masked man leaned closer. Because Emma, she never really left. The escape attempt? Emma's hands were still bound, but adrenaline surged through her veins. She had to get out. The man turned away for just a second, and that was all she needed. She lunged forward, kicking the chair backward, sending both herself and the chair crashing to the floor. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she ignored it. The man growled in frustration, reaching for her, but Emma was faster. She rolled onto her side, smashing the chair against the ground until the wooden frame splintered. Her wrists were free. Without thinking, she grabbed a jagged piece of wood and slashed at the masked man's arm. He let out a sharp hiss of pain, stumbling back. Emma ran. Her bare feet pounded against the concrete as she sprinted through a dark hallway, heart hammering in her chest. There had to be a way out. There had to be. The horrifying discovery. She turned a corner and nearly slammed into a metal door. Fumbling with the handle, she yanked it open and froze. Her stomach twisted. Inside the room were photos, hundreds of them, taped to the walls. All of them were of her, pictures from years ago. Her high school graduation, her college dorm, her favorite coffee shop, and the most recent, a picture of her sleeping in James's apartment. He had been watching her for years. Her breath came in shallow gasps. This wasn't just stalking, this was obsession. Nowhere to run. A slow clap echoed behind her. Emma turned sharply to see the masked man standing in the doorway. Blood dripped from his arm where she had stabbed him, but he didn't seem to care. "You're smarter than I expected," he mused. Emma backed away. "Why are you doing this?" The man stepped closer. "Because, Emma, you were supposed to disappear that night too." She felt her knees go weak. "What?" He tilted his head. "Lillian wasn't the only one marked that night. You were supposed to go with her." Emma's world spun. "You're lying." "Am I?" he whispered. He took another step forward. "You survived that night, Emma. But Lillian didn't, and someone had to finish what was started." Emma's mind screamed at her to move, but before she could react, he lunged. She barely dodged as he grabbed for her throat. Emma shoved a table between them, knocking over a stack of photographs. Her eyes darted around, searching for a weapon, anything. Her fingers wrapped around a rusty metal pipe. She swung it with everything she had. The pipe collided with his head, sending him stumbling backward. Emma didn't wait. She ran, down the hall, through the open door, and into the freezing night air. A haunting realization. Emma sprinted toward the nearest road, breath ragged. Her bare feet stung against the rough pavement, but she didn't stop. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance. She stumbled into the road, waving frantically. The car screeched to a stop, and a familiar voice called out. "Emma." Her knees nearly buckled. "James." Tears blurred her vision as she collapsed against the car. "It's him, James! He's real! She turned around, pointing toward the building, but the doorway was empty. The masked man was gone. James wrapped an arm around her. "We need to get you to the police now." But as James sped down the road, Emma's mind was racing. Who was he? Why was she supposed to disappear that night? And the worst thought of all, was Lillian still out there somewhere? She shivered, staring into the darkness, because deep down she knew this wasn't over. Emma sat in the dimly lit police station, a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her hands were still trembling. The events of the past few hours replayed in her mind like a broken horror film. The masked man, the pictures, the chilling words. "You were supposed to disappear that night too." Detective Mark Hansen sat across from her, flipping through a file. His gruff voice broke the silence. "Emma, we're moving you to a safe house. Until we figure out who this guy is, you can't go home." She nodded slowly, exhaustion sinking into her bones. Maybe this nightmare was finally over. She was wrong. It was only beginning. The chilling package. A few hours later, Emma was escorted to a safe house, a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods. It was meant to be secure. Only a few officers knew the location. She had barely settled in when a knock sounded at the door. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't expecting anyone. A uniformed officer checked the peephole and frowned. No one was there. Cautiously, he opened the door and found a small package sitting on the doorstep. No return address, no markings. Just Emma's name written in bold black ink. Detective Hansen ordered everyone to step back. "Bomb squad, No, this wasn't an explosive. It was something far worse. Inside the package was a single item, Emma's missing red scarf. And wrapped around it was a note. 24 hours left. You can't run from fate. Emma's stomach dropped. He had found her. The phone call from hell. That night, the safe house was on high alert. 2 officers guarded the entrance. The windows were locked. Security cameras monitored every angle. Yet, despite all the precautions, Emma's phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown caller. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She didn't want to answer. She knew who it was. But before she could press decline, the call answered on its own. A low, distorted voice whispered, "Knock, knock." A loud bang echoed from outside. Emma's blood ran cold. Someone was knocking on the front door. The surveillance footage. The officers outside didn't see anyone. They checked the cameras. Nothing, just an empty snow-covered front yard. But when they replayed the footage, something terrifying happened. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the cameras glitched for 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, a dark figure appeared at the front door, just standing there, still, motionless. Then, in the next frame, he was gone. Emma covered her mouth, trying not to scream. One officer whispered, "That's impossible." Detective Hansen gritted his teeth. "We're moving you, now." The trap is set. Instead of relocating Emma immediately, the police devised a plan. They would use Emma as bait. They had one goal, to draw the masked man out and catch him. Emma hesitated, but knew this was the only way to end things. So that night, she did exactly as planned. She sat by the window, pretending to be alone. She kept the lights dim. She left the door unlocked. And she waited. Minutes passed, then hours. Nothing. Maybe he wasn't coming. Maybe 3:33 a.m. The phone rang. Emma's heart pounded as she slowly picked it up. "Look behind you." She turned around and froze. The front door was open. A single footprint in the snow led inside. The betrayal. Panic surged through her as she backed away. "He's inside!" she screamed. Officers rushed in, sweeping the cabin with their weapons drawn, but no one was there. Nothing was disturbed, except one of the officers was missing. James. He was gone. Detective Hansen's face darkened. "Find him. Now!" The officers combed the area, but they were already too late, because across the street, taped to a tree, was a second package. Inside was James's police badge covered in blood. And another note. One by one, they all disappear, just like Lillian. Emma collapsed to her knees, horror sinking in. James was gone, and she was next. The unmasking. Desperation turned into determination. Emma was done running. She needed to end this, tonight. Following the only clue she had, the mention of Lillian, she convinced Detective Hansen to take her to their old neighborhood. Back to the place where Lillian had vanished, the abandoned house at the end of the street. It was boarded up, covered in vines, but someone had been here recently. A dim light flickered inside. Emma pushed the door open and stepped into the darkness, and that's when she saw it. That's when she saw it. The wall of missing people, photos of Lillian, photos of James, and in the center, a mirror. Emma stared at her own reflection, confused. Why was she here? And then she noticed it, a figure standing behind her, the masked man. He grabbed her before she could scream. The final truth, Emma struggled, kicking and thrashing. "Why are you doing this?" she sobbed. The man slowly removed his mask. Emma's breath caught in her throat, because beneath the mask was James, her best friend, the one person she trusted most. Tears burned in her eyes. "No, you're lying. James is missing." He smirked. "I never left Emma." Her mind reeled. "But why?" James stepped closer, his voice a chilling whisper. "Because I was there that night, Emma. The night Lillian disappeared, and I know what really happened." She shook her head frantically. "No, I don't remember." "Yes, you do." His eyes darkened. "You were the last person to see Lillian alive, because you were the one who killed her." Emma's world shattered. Memories flooded back, things she had buried deep inside. Lillian's screams, blood on her hands. The terrible realization that James wasn't lying. She had killed her best friend and forgotten. But James never did. This wasn't about stalking. This was revenge. The final showdown. James lunged at her, but this time, Emma fought back. She grabbed the nearest object, a rusted metal rod, and swung it as hard as she could. James staggered back. Blood dripped from his forehead. Emma didn't stop. She swung again and again, until James collapsed, motionless. Sirens wailed in the distance. Detective Hansen burst in, gun raised. But it was over. Emma stood over James' unconscious body, breathing heavily, and for the first time in years, she remembered everything. The past had finally caught up to her, but she had survived. This time, she wouldn't forget. Emma stood frozen, her breath coming in ragged gasps. James lay motionless on the ground, blood trickling from the wound on his forehead. Her fingers trembled as she looked down at them. Nay, they were stained red. Just like before, just like the night Lillian disappeared. The past she had buried deep inside was clawing its way back. She turned sharply as Detective Hansen entered the abandoned house, gun raised. "Emma, drop the weapon!" She let the metal rod slip from her fingers. A voice came out in a whisper. "I remember everything now." The memory that changed everything. James wasn't lying. That night, the night Lillian vanished, Emma had been there. She had heard the screams, she had seen the blood, and she had run. She had locked those memories away, convinced herself that she was innocent. But now, they were back. Lillian wasn't murdered by some unknown killer. She was murdered by Emma. The truth about James. Before Emma could process the truth, James let out a low groan. He was still alive. Detective Hansen rushed forward, pinning James to the ground. "Tell me why," Emma whispered, her voice hoarse. James let out a weak chuckle. "Because you needed to remember." Tears welled in Emma's eyes. "You tortured me for weeks just to make me remember?" James coughed, blood dripping from his lips. "You don't get it, do you?" He laughed bitterly. "I never wanted to kill you, Emma. I wanted you to know what it felt like. To be haunted. To be hunted. Just like Lillian was." Emma's stomach twisted. So, the calls, the stalking, the threats, it was all you? James smirked. "Not all of it." Detective Hansen frowned. "What do you mean?" James slowly turned his head to the dark corner of the room. Emma followed his gaze, and her heart nearly stopped. Because standing in the shadows was another figure. A man wearing a dark hoodie. A man she had never seen before, and he was holding a phone. The same unknown number that had been calling her for weeks. Like the real caller, the hooded man stepped forward, his face partially obscured by the dim light. Detective Hansen instantly raised his gun. "Hands where I can see them?" But the man didn't react. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and smiled. "Hello, Emma." Her blood turned ice cold. That voice. It was the same voice from the phone calls. The same voice that whispered her secrets in the dead of night. The voice that had known everything. But this time, it wasn't distorted. It was real. This was the true caller. The real mastermind. James had been a pawn, but this man, he was the player. The final game. Emma's legs nearly gave out beneath her. Who are you?" she whispered. The man chuckled. "Oh, Emma, you don't remember me? That hurts." He took another step closer. "Let me remind you." He reached into his pocket and tossed something at her feet. A small, silver locket. Emma's breath hitched. She knew that locket. It was Lillian's. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Inside was a photo, a picture of her, Lillian, and her heart nearly stopped. The man in the hoodie. Younger, smiling, standing beside them like he had always belonged. Emma's eyes widened in horror. No, it can't be you. But deep down, she knew the truth. The man standing before her was Lillian's older brother, Ryan. The one who had been away at college, dead, the one who had never stopped looking for answers, the one who had finally found them. The ultimate revenge. Ryan's expression darkened. "You really buried it deep, didn't you, Emma?" Emma shook her head frantically. "I didn't mean to. Save it." His voice was sharp as a blade. "You left her there to die, and then you erased it, like she never even mattered." Emma felt the weight of her guilt crushing her. Ryan had devoted years to uncovering the truth. And now he had it. The anonymous calls, the threats, the relentless torment. It had all been him. Not because he wanted to kill her, but because he wanted her to suffer. Just like Lillian had suffered. Just like he had suffered. For 10 years. Living with the truth that no one else knew. The final choice. Detective Hansen tightened his grip on his gun. "Put your hands up, Ryan. It's over." Ryan smirked. No, detective, for Emma, it's just beginning. Before anyone could react, Ryan pulled something from his pocket. Not a gun, not a knife. A second phone. He pressed a button and suddenly, Emma's phone lit up. A message. A video. Her fingers trembled as she tapped play, and what she saw made her want to scream. It was footage of that night, the night Lillian disappeared. Emma and Lillian arguing. Lillian slipping, the sickening crack as her head hit the rocks. Emma standing frozen, and then Emma running away. The truth was out. It had always been out. Ryan had recorded it. Ryan took a step closer, his eyes burning with fury. Now tell me, Emma, how does it feel to finally remember? Emma's knees buckled, tears streamed down her face. For years, she had convinced herself that she wasn't a murderer, that she wasn't guilty, but the truth was staring her in the face, and she couldn't escape it anymore. She had killed Lillian, and someone had always known. Ryan smirked one last time. Then, before Detective Hansen could stop him, he vanished into the night, gone, leaving only one thing behind: the locket and the unbearable weight of the past. Closing scene, the unfinished story. Days later, Emma sat alone in an interrogation room. Detective Hansen placed a file in front of her. Ryan was gone. James was in custody, but the case was far from over. The truth was out. But was justice ever truly served? As Emma stared at the locket in her hands, a single thought ran through her mind. What if he comes back? Because somewhere out there, Ryan was still watching, still waiting, still knowing everything. And next time, he wouldn't just make her remember, he would make her pay. Samuel Gray had always loved old houses. The way history clung to their walls, the echoes of past lives trapped in every creaky floorboard, there was something comforting about it. Or at least, that's what he used to believe before he moved into the Holloway house. The house stood at the edge of Ravensbrook, an isolated town with a past no one wanted to talk about. It had been abandoned for years, the for sale sign standing as a silent warning rather than an invitation. But for Samuel, it was perfect. Cheap, spacious, and full of character, just what he needed for his writing retreat. But the very first night, something felt off. The air inside the house was heavier than it should have been. It wasn't just dust or the musty scent of wood that had been left untouched for decades. It was something else, something unseen. As he carried his last box inside, he noticed the old attic door at the end of the hallway. It was bolted shut, unlike the other doors, as if someone had locked it for a reason. A chill crawled down his spine, but he shook it off. Just another door, he muttered to himself. Samuel had no idea that beyond that door, something was waiting. Watching. Listening. Samuel spent the evening unpacking, arranging his books, and setting up his workspace. He placed his laptop near the large window, overlooking the dead garden outside. The town was eerily silent, no sound of cars or people, just the occasional gust of wind that rattled the old glass panes. By the time he settled in for bed, the house was swallowed in darkness, but the silence didn't last long. Somewhere above him, something moved. A faint creaking, almost rhythmic like footsteps pacing across the attic floor. Samuel's eyes snapped open. He held his breath, listening. The sound stopped. He exhaled. Probably the old wood adjusting to the night air. Houses like these made noises. That's what he told himself. But just as he turned on his side, he heard it again. Creak, creak, footsteps, slow, deliberate, right above his bed. A strange sensation gripped him, like an invisible force pressing down on his chest. He wanted to get up, check the attic, but something held him still. Then, a whisper. Not words, just a soft, rasping breath, as if someone was standing right by his ear. Samuel's body tensed, his heart pounded against his ribs. He turned his head slowly, scanning the room. Nothing. The house was empty. Wasn't it? His throat felt dry as he finally forced himself to sit up. Hello? His voice was barely a whisper. Silence. The footsteps had stopped. Samuel shook his head, running a hand through his hair. Just my mind playing tricks on me. He reached for his glass of water, but his hand froze midair. The water in the glass was rippling. Like something had disturbed it. A deep unease settled in his gut.
He turned on the bedside lamp, bathing the room in a warm glow. Everything looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. Deciding he was just exhausted, he forced himself to lie down. The attic could wait until morning. He just needed sleep. But as he closed his eyes, he had the strange sensation that someone, somewhere, was watching him. The second night, the locked door. The following day, Samuel tried to shake off the previous night's events. He convinced himself that the noises had been the house settling. The whisper, probably his imagination. By evening, rain lashed against the windows and the wind howled through the trees like a wounded animal. The entire house groaned under the weight of the storm, making it feel even more isolated. Samuel poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat by the fireplace, staring at the flames. That's when he heard it again. Creak. Creak. Footsteps. Samuel's grip tightened around his glass. Not again. The sound came from directly above him, the attic. He slowly stood up, heart hammering. This time he wouldn't ignore it. He grabbed a flashlight and made his way down the hallway toward the locked attic door. As he stood in front of it, the air seemed to grow colder. The doorknob looked worn, like someone had gripped it tightly, recently. Samuel swallowed hard. He reached out and tried to turn it, locked. He hesitated for a second before he heard it. A soft thud. Then another. Something on the other side was moving. He staggered back. Every part of his body screamed at him to leave it alone, to go back. But something in him needed to know. Taking a deep breath, he rummaged through the drawers until he found an old iron key labeled attic. His fingers trembled as he inserted it into the lock. Click. The door creaked open. The attic was pitch black. The air smelled stale, like rotting wood and something sour, like old decay. Samuel raised his flashlight. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating dust-covered boxes and forgotten furniture. But then, his breath caught in his throat. At the far end of the attic, a chair was facing the wall, and sitting in it was a figure. No movement, no sound, just a shadowy figure sitting eerily still. Samuel's mind screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The flashlight flickered, his breath quickened. Then, the figure turned its head. Samuel's blood turned to ice. There was no face, just a smooth, featureless surface. A choked gasp left his lips as he stumbled back. The figure slowly stood, its movements unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Then, in a voice that was both distant and chillingly close, it whispered, "You shouldn't have opened the door." The attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Darkness swallowed everything, and Samuel's scream echoed through the house. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. His flashlight flickered violently as the attic door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in total darkness. For a few seconds he stood frozen, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, a whisper, soft, right next to his ear. "Why did you open the door?" Samuel jerked around, his flashlight trembling in his grip. He aimed the beam wildly across the attic, but the figure was gone. His hands trembled as he reached for the door handle. Locked. He twisted, pulled, slammed his shoulder against it. Nothing. Something was inside here with him. The air was thick, heavy. Every breath felt like inhaling cold fog. His pulse thundered in his ears as he backed away, his flashlight beam flickering across the cluttered space. The attic was bigger than it seemed from the outside. The dim light caught glimpses of forgotten things, dust-covered trunks, old furniture draped in white sheets, a cracked mirror leaning against the far wall. And then, in the beam of his flashlight, he saw it. The chair. It was empty. Samuel's stomach twisted into knots. His skin felt ice cold. He had seen something sitting there. A figure. A faceless figure. He backed away slowly, trying to suppress the rising panic clawing at his throat. Then, tap! A soft sound like a bare foot stepping on wood. Samuel's breath hitched. He swung his flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. But the air had shifted. He wasn't alone. The flashlight flickered, the shadows twisted, and then a hand shot out from behind an old dresser. Gray. Too long. Fingers bent at unnatural angles. Samuel stumbled backward, his foot catching on a loose floorboard. He hit the ground hard, the flashlight rolling from his grasp, spinning wildly. Tap, 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 tap. The sound of bare footsteps on wood. Getting closer, he scrambled onto his hands and knees, lunging for the flashlight. and that's when he saw them. Footprints appearing in the dust, one by one, slowly moving toward him, but there was no body attached to them. A strangled cry tore from his throat as he grabbed the flashlight, shining it toward the footprints. And then, everything went still. For one horrible second, nothing moved. Then, a voice, right next to his ear, low, raspy. Wrong. You are not supposed to be here. Samuel's flashlight died. The attic was swallowed by complete and utter darkness, and something breathed right in front of him. The desperate escape, Samuel lunged for the door again, slamming his fists against it. Let me out! Somebody help! The walls groaned. The air grew colder. The whispers started again, circling him, surrounding him. And then, a new sound. Faint. From the other side of the door. A voice. Samuel? His heart nearly leaped out of his chest. Someone was outside. Help! I'm trapped, he screamed, slamming his fists against the door. The voice on the other side hesitated. Then Samuel opened the door. His blood turned to ice. The voice, it was his own. Low, hollow, an exact replica of his own voice speaking from the other side of the locked attic door. Let me in, Samuel. Samuel stumbled back, shaking his head violently. No, this isn't real. The voice whispered again, softer now. You opened the door, now you have to stay. Something slammed into the door from the other side. The wood splintered. Samuel let out a choked sob, scrambling back toward the farthest corner of the attic. The door shook, another slam, and another. Something was trying to break in, or worse, something was trying to get out. He needed to think. Fast. His flashlight was dead. The door was locked. No way out. But then he saw it. A window. The plunge into darkness. Samuel didn't hesitate. He lunged toward the small attic window, fumbling with the latch. Locked. Slam. The attic door cracked. He pounded on the window, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The latch wouldn't budge. Behind him, the door splintered further. A cold gust of air rushed into the attic as something stepped through the crack. He refused to turn around. With a final desperate push, he shattered the window with his elbow. The glass cut into his skin, but he barely felt it. The storm outside raged. Wind howled through the trees. Rain lashed against the rooftop. Below was nothing but blackness. A 2-story drop. Death if he landed wrong. But if he stayed, he didn't let himself think. With a final, ragged breath, he jumped. The last thing he heard before he hit the ground was the attic door finally bursting open, and something laughing, low, hollow, his own voice. Then, everything went blur. Wind howling through trees. Hit the ground hard. Pain exploded through his body as he landed on the cold, wet earth. His vision blurred, the world spinning. For a moment he lay still, his breath coming in sharp gasps. Then, a sound. From above. The attic window slammed shut. Samuel forced himself up, ignoring the burning pain in his shoulder. His head pounded. His hands were scratched and bleeding from the glass, his pulse a wild, erratic beat. But he was alive. He had escaped. Or so he thought. Samuel stumbled away from the house, limping toward the dense forest. He needed to get to the road. He needed help. The rain lashed against his skin as he pushed forward, the wind howling through the trees like whispers. Every branch seemed to move, every shadow stretched unnaturally. Then he heard it, a voice. Samuel. It came from behind him, from the house. Slowly he turned. Through the sheets of rain, the old house stood in eerie silence. No lights, no movement, but something was different. His window, the one he had jumped from, it was perfectly intact, like it had never been broken. Samuel's stomach twisted into knots. He knew he had shattered it. He had felt the glass cut into his skin. And yet, there it was, untouched. His breath came in short, sharp bursts. His mind screamed at him to keep moving, to get away. Then another voice. Samuel, wait. His heart nearly stopped, because this time the voice wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from the trees, from inside the forest. The path that loops. Samuel turned and ran. The mud sucked at his boots, the rain blinding him as he crashed through the thick undergrowth. His pulse hammered in his ears. He ran until his lungs burned, until the house was far behind him, until he was sure he was alone. Then he stopped, panting, shaking. He leaned against a tree, trying to catch his breath. The road had to be closed. He had walked down it before. But when he turned to look, his stomach dropped. Because there, standing in the distance through the mist and trees, was the house. Impossible. Samuel's body turned ice cold. He had run straight ahead. He had never turned back. How was he back at the house? He staggered backward, his mind reeling. No, this was wrong. He spun on his heel and ran again. This time, he went a different direction. Faster, farther, until he saw something ahead, a road. He gasped in relief, pushing toward it, but as he stepped out of the trees, there it was. The house. The entity that watches. Samuel's breath hitched. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Something was playing with him. A presence, a force, something old. Then, from the porch, the door opened. Slowly, a creaking invitation. Samuel shook his head violently. No, I'm not going back. Then, something stepped out. A figure. Tall, motionless. Samuel couldn't see its face. The shadows clung to it like the night itself was bending around its form. Then it moved. Not walking, not stepping, gliding toward him. Samuel stumbled backward, his voice caught in his throat. His legs refused to move. The figure stopped a few feet away. Then it spoke. You're home now. The basement that whispers. Samuel didn't remember moving. One moment, he was in the forest. The next, he was inside the house. The front door slammed shut behind him. He let out a sharp breath, whipping around. His hands clawed at the handle, locked. The air inside was thick, suffocating. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper. And then a voice from the basement, soft, calling his name. He turned slowly, his body rigid with fear. The basement door stood wide open, black, empty, a void that seemed to breathe. Then footsteps, coming up the basement stairs, slow, deliberate. Samuel's pulse skyrocketed. He took a step back. Then another sound, from above, from the attic, footsteps coming down. His breath hitched, from the basement, from the attic, both at the same time coming toward him. Samuel's mind screamed. He turned to run, but the moment he did, a hand shot out of the basement, gray, long, clawed, grabbing his ankle, pulling him down. Samuel screamed. Then the lights went out beneath the floor. Samuel's scream ripped through the house, but it was swallowed by the darkness. The hand tightened around his ankle, its grip ice cold, inhuman. He kicked violently, thrashing, trying to pull away, but the thing was strong, stronger than anything he had ever felt. Then a second hand. It shot out of the basement, its long, bony fingers clawing at his leg, dragging him toward the gaping void below. Samuel's nails dug into the floorboards, scraping against the old wood, his heart hammering in his chest. He kicked again, harder. The hands let go. For a split second, he was free. But before he could move, the basement door slammed shut on its own. Samuel stumbled back, gasping for breath. His ankle throbbed, an icy burn spreading up his leg where the thing had grabbed him. Silence. The house was completely still. Then a whisper, faint, right behind him. Run. Samuel spun around. Nobody was there, but he could feel it, something in the room with him. Watching, he backed away, his breath shaky, his only thought, I have to get out of here. But then, the floorboards beneath him shifted, and before he could react, they collapsed, buried beneath the house. Samuel fell hard. He landed on cold, wet earth. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a few seconds, everything spun. Then silence. He groaned, pushing himself up. His hands sank into damp soil. It smelled rotten, like something long dead. The air was thick, almost impossible to breathe, and as his eyes adjusted, he realized he wasn't in the basement. This place was older, deeper. The walls around him weren't made of wood or concrete. They were made of stone, covered in strange carvings, symbols, names, and scratch marks, like someone had tried to claw their way out. A shiver ran down Samuel's spine. He turned, looking for a way back up, and then he heard them. The voices, they came from the walls, 100 whispers, hissing, murmuring, chanting. Then one voice rose above the rest, a woman's voice, faint, weeping. Please, don't let it take me. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He turned frantically, searching the darkness. But he was alone, or so he thought, because something moved in the shadows. A figure, small, curled in the corner, a girl, long, tangled black hair covering her face. Samuel froze. Hello? His voice was hoarse. Who are you? The girl didn't move, didn't answer. Then her head snapped up, and Samuel felt his blood run cold. Her eyes were missing, just empty black sockets. And yet, she was staring right at him. Then, in a voice not her own, she whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." The room of the forgotten. The air turned ice cold. The whispers grew louder, filling the space, pressing in on him from all sides. Samuel backed away from the girl, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. This time, she answered. "I'm one of them," she said. "One of the ones he took." Samuel swallowed hard. Who took you?" The girl's empty eyes twitched. Then, she lifted her hand and pointed. Samuel turned, and his stomach dropped. Because standing there, emerging from the shadows, was something wrong. Something tall. Something wearing a face that was not its own, its head tilted unnaturally. And then it moved. A blur. Too fast. Samuel had no time to react. The thing was already upon him. A hand closed around his throat. Cold. Unforgiving. Lifting him off the ground. He struggled, gasped, kicked. The thing leaned in. Its face shifted, twisted, changing. Samuel saw himself. A perfect reflection. It smiled. "You were never supposed to leave," it whispered. Samuel's vision blurred. The darkness closed in. The choice? Samuel woke up with a start. Gasping for air, he was on the floor of the old house. The front door was wide open. Outside, the sun was rising. Samuel sat up, his head spinning, his hands were trembling, his clothes damp with sweat. The house was silent. Empty, like nothing had ever happened. Had it been a nightmare? A hallucination? He looked down at his arms. His skin was bruised where the thing had grabbed him. No, it was real. Samuel slowly stood, staring at the open door. He could leave. Now, but something in his gut told him the house wasn't done with him yet. And then the girl's voice echoed in his head. "You shouldn't have come here." Samuel took a deep breath, and then, instead of running, he turned back toward the house. The threshold between worlds and the open door beckoned him. Sunlight poured in from outside, warm and golden, a sharp contrast to the cold, suffocating darkness of the house behind him. He could run. He could leave this nightmare behind. But something inside him whispered, "It's not over." His fingers twitched, his body screamed at him to move, but instead he turned, back toward the darkness, back into the house. The voices returned. The second Samuel stepped forward, the door behind him slammed shut. The sunlight vanished and the house came alive. The floorboards creaked, the walls groaned, the air grew thick, suffocating. And then the whispers returned, hundreds of voices, hissing, chanting, laughing, but one voice rose above the rest, a deep, grating sound. The voice of the thing that wore his face. "You chose to stay." Samuel's heart pounded. He looked around, his breath sharp and ragged. The shadows in the corners twisted, moved. And then he saw it, the mirror. A large, dust-covered mirror stood against the far wall. Samuel's reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't him. His reflection smiled. Then it stepped forward. The other Samuel. Samuel stumbled back, his hands trembling, but his reflection kept walking forward, out of the mirror, into reality. It tilted its head, watching him. Then, in his own voice, it whispered, "You don't belong here anymore." Samuel shook his head, panic rising. What do you mean?" The other Samuel's eyes darkened. "I've been waiting, watching. This house doesn't want you, it wants me." Samuel's breath, he backed away, but the house shifted around him. The floor stretched, the walls twisted, like the house itself was deciding. The other Samuel grinned. "One of us stays. The final choice." The air grew heavier. The whispers grew louder. The other Samuel took a step closer, then another. Samuel felt it happening, his body growing cold. Like something was pulling him away. The house was choosing. And it wasn't choosing him. He opened his mouth to scream, but the shadows rushed toward him, engulfing him, drowning him, and then everything went black. A new beginning? Morning. The house stood silent, empty. The front door swung open, and a man stepped out. He stretched, breathing in the crisp air. The sun warmed his skin. He turned, looking back at the house one last time, then he smiled and walked away. Inside, the mirror stood untouched, dusty, cracked, and if someone looked closely, they would see a man inside, screaming, but no one could hear him because Samuel never left. The house chose him to stay, and now the other Samuel was free, walking the world in his place. The house always wins. The house remained, waiting for its next guest. For the next poor soul who would dare to step inside, because the house never lets go, it just finds replacements. And Samuel? Samuel was now just another whisper in the walls. Trapped. Forever. End of chapter 5. The house has taken another soul, but the other Samuel is now free, walking among the living. Did he take Samuel's life, or was he always meant to be the real one? The house doesn't answer, because the house never speaks. It only watches, and it waits for you. Would you survive this house?
Daniel Carter had never believed in ghosts. He was a man of reason, a skeptic who scoffed at urban legends and old wives' tales. But when he inherited his estranged grandfather's abandoned house deep in the countryside, he found himself questioning everything. The house had been empty for over 40 years, ever since his grandfather, Henry Carter, mysteriously vanished. No one had dared to step inside since. As Daniel pulled up the long, winding driveway, his headlights barely cut through the thick fog that clung to the old house like a shroud. The place was massive. Its once grand exterior now rotting, windows dark and lifeless. The wooden porch creaked under his boots as he stepped toward the front door. The moment he turned the key in the lock, something felt wrong. The air inside was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of damp wood and something metallic like rust or blood. Furniture sat draped in white sheets, untouched, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Then the first whisper came. Soft, faint, like someone just behind him. He spun around. Nothing. Just the house settling in the cold night. But the whisper came again. This time, closer. You shouldn't have come back. Daniel's breath hitched. He tried to rationalize it. The wind, the old pipes, his own exhaustion. But deep down, he knew. Something was here. The hidden room. Determined not to let fear consume him, Daniel searched the house. He had to understand why his grandfather disappeared. His search led him to an old study, its walls lined with books covered in dust. A large fireplace sat at the center, its bricks blackened with age. But something was off. One of the wooden panels beside it looked different. With a firm push, the panel creaked open, revealing a hidden passage. Daniel's stomach tightened. Cobwebs stretched across the narrow corridor. The air was thick with decay. His flashlight flickered as he stepped inside, revealing deep scratches along the walls. And then he found it, an old, tattered journal. Flipping through the fragile pages, Daniel's hands shook as he read the scrawled words. They whisper to me. They watch. I am not alone in this house. His grandfather had written these words days before he disappeared. Suddenly, the door behind him slammed shut. The voice in the dark. Darkness swallowed the room. Daniel's breathing grew ragged as he pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then, in the pitch-black silence, the whisper returned. But this time it was inside the room with him. You should have stayed away. A cold breath brushed against his ear. He turned wildly, but his flashlight was failing, its beam flickering like a dying heartbeat. A figure loomed in the corner. Tall, shadowy, not human. Daniel froze. His body screamed to run, but he couldn't move. The figure drifted forward, its presence suffocating, its whisper now a raspy, gurgling voice. He tried to leave. He tried to warn you. Daniel's mind raced. His grandfather. Had he been trapped here all along? Summoning every ounce of courage, he lunged for the door, slamming his body against it. The wood cracked, splintering apart, and then he was free. Escape or not. Daniel staggered into the hallway, gasping for breath. The house was alive now, doors rattling, walls creaking, the whispers screaming. He ran for the front door, but just as he reached it, a hand, cold, bony, grabbed his wrist.
He turned, expecting to see the shadowed figure, but instead, it was his grandfather, or what was left of him. His eyes were hollow, his face stretched in a permanent scream, and as Daniel stood frozen, his grandfather spoke in a whisper that sent ice through his veins. "Leave. Burn it. Don't let it escape." Daniel stumbled back. The house wanted him to stay. No, he wouldn't let it take him too. With all his strength, he ripped free and ran. Behind him, the whispers turned into shrieks. The walls shook. The house screamed. And then, silence. When he turned back, the house was gone. Nothing but a blackened patch of earth remained, as if it had never existed. But Daniel knew better. It was still somewhere, waiting and listening. The final whisper. Years later, Daniel sat in his apartment trying to forget, trying to convince himself it was just a nightmare. But then, one night, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. With shaking hands, he answered, and in the dead silence, a voice whispered, "You can't escape." The line went dead. Daniel knew, at that moment, the house had found him again.